For 41 years I delivered post to the same set of streets in Drumcondra, on the north side of Dublin, and I could have told you, blindfolded, which house on which road belonged to which family, going back generations in some cases, grandparents to grandchildren, the same letterbox rusting a little more each decade. There's a particular satisfaction in that kind of work that people who've never done it don't always understand. You know exactly where everything goes. Every envelope has an address, every address has a name, and if the name changes, you find out why, usually before the neighbors do. I want you to hold on to that idea, because it's going to matter a great deal later, when I tell you about a different kind of list altogether, one I never learned to read properly, until it had already cost me everything I meant to retire on. My name is Wallace Duffy. I'm 68 years old, from Dublin, 41 years walking a postal route before my knees finally told me it was time to stop. My wife Eileen passed 6 years ago now, breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and I won't dwell on those months except to say that a man doesn't come out the other side of watching that quite the same as he went in. We had 2 children. Connor, still in Dublin, works in insurance, married with a boy of his own now, and Aoife, over in London doing something in marketing I've never fully understood, despite her patient explanations. Good kids, both of them, though after Eileen died the house on our street felt entirely too large for one man and his memories, and I found myself, most evenings, sitting in a chair that used to be mine and hers, and was now simply mine, wondering what exactly I was meant to do with the next 20 years. The 2 years between Eileen's funeral and meeting Bing were, I'll admit now, harder than I let on to anyone at the time, including Connor and Aoife. I kept the postal round up longer than my knees really allowed, mostly, I think, because the structure of it, up at 5:30, the same streets, the same faces on the same days, gave a shape to my mornings that the rest of the day badly lacked. I retired properly about 8 months after Eileen died, and I remember the first Monday morning afterward. No round to walk, no letters to sort, just the 2 of us in that house, except now only one of us was actually there, and I sat at the kitchen table until nearly noon, simply not knowing what a man was meant to do with himself under those circumstances. I tried a bowls club for a while, the way Irish widowers of a certain generation are more or less expected to. I went twice. It wasn't the company I minded, it was the particular quality of sympathy directed at me by men who'd known Eileen and me as a couple for 30 years, sympathy that felt, each time, like being reminded of the exact shape of what I'd lost. I stopped going, told myself I'd take it up again once I was feeling stronger, and never did. I met Bing through a family connection, not an app, not a bar, nothing so modern. My late wife's cousin's daughter worked as a carer in a nursing home out in Blanchardstown, and a good number of the staff there were Filipino, and through that loose network of introductions I ended up, about 2 years after Eileen died, at a small gathering for someone's confirmation, where Bing was helping in the kitchen, laughing with the other women, and I remember thinking, quite plainly, that I hadn't heard a laugh like that in longer than I could comfortably admit. Bing was 31 at the time, working as a caregiver herself, sending money home regularly to her family in Lipa, in Batangas province, a couple hours south of Manila. We talked that whole evening, mostly about nothing important. Her work, my old postal route, a shared, slightly baffled affection for Irish weather that she said reminded her, oddly, of how much she missed the heat back home, even while claiming to love the change of seasons. I liked her directness. She didn't dress up her circumstances for me, told me plainly about her family's situation, a father who'd passed years earlier, a mother running a small carinderia, siblings scattered between Batangas and Manila working whatever work they could find. I found that honesty disarming. The same way, I suppose, other men in these stories find their partner's initial honesty disarming, before they learn how much honesty and strategy can sometimes wear the same clothes. We married 18 months later, a small ceremony here in Dublin that Connor walked me through the paperwork for, and Aoife flew in from London for, and I remember standing at the altar thinking that I hadn't expected, at 65, to feel that particular kind of nervous joy again. I want to be clear that I don't regret marrying Bing, even now, even after everything I'm about to tell you. That part of this story, the marriage itself, I still believe was real, or as real as anything gets to be, between two people from such different worlds trying to build something together. I want to describe the wedding itself a little more, because it's one of the few unambiguously good memories from this whole account, untouched by everything that came after. Connor gave a small speech, careful and warm in the way he always is, that made specific mention of his mother, saying he thought she'd have liked Bing, which meant more to me than he probably realized at the time. Nanay Corazon couldn't make the trip to Dublin, visa complications that never quite resolved in time, but she'd sent, through a relative flying over separately, a small woven basket of dried mangoes and a handwritten note in careful English wishing us both a long, healthy life together. I still have that note. It's one of the few things from that side of the family I've kept without any complicated feelings attached to it. My old postal colleagues turned out in force for the reception. A good dozen of them, men I'd worked alongside for decades, and I remember one of them, a fellow named Malachi who'd walked a neighboring round for nearly as long as I had, pulling me aside near the end of the night, a bit of drink in him, and saying, half joking, half not, "Wallace, you mind yourself out there, now." Different world entirely. I laughed it off at the time, told him I knew what I was doing. I think about that comment more than I'd like to admit, 3 years on. We split our time between Dublin and Lipa over the following 2 years, and I grew genuinely fond of Batangas, of the noise and the heat, and the way an entire neighbourhood seemed to know each other's business, in a manner that reminded me, oddly, of my own postal route back home, except turned up considerably in volume. Bing's mother, Nanay Corazon, ran that small carinderia I mentioned, and I liked her enormously. Sharp, funny, endlessly generous with food, even when I suspect money was tighter than she ever let on to me directly. It was Bing's older brother, Ray, who first raised the idea of the Sari-Sari stores, sitting around Nanay Corazon's table one evening, about 2 years into the marriage, over San Miguel and a plate of grilled bangus. Ray worked odd construction jobs, unreliable seasonal income, and he'd clearly been turning the idea over for some time, before he finally pitched it to me directly. Sari-Sari stores, he explained, were the arteries of every Filipino neighborhood, small, family-run corner shops selling everything from instant coffee sachets to cooking oil to cigarettes sold individually. Guaranteed foot traffic because everyone needed something small nearly every day. His idea wasn't to open one store, it was to open 6, spread across different barangays around Lipa, each one staffed by a different relative. A niece here, a cousin there, Ray himself overseeing the whole network like, he said, a little distribution business. I want to be fair to my own thinking at the time, because I've spent 3 years turning this decision over, and I still believe the underlying logic wasn't foolish, even though the execution nearly ruined me. Sari-Sari stores are, genuinely, a stable, low-risk business model in the Philippines. Small margins, but reliable ones. Built on genuine daily necessity, rather than luxury spending that dries up in hard times. I'd read enough by then about expat life in the Philippines to know that funding a small local business was a common and often sensible way to generate income that didn't depend on a foreign pension stretching further than it should. I thought I was doing something prudent, not reckless. I put in 48,000 euros altogether, across about 6 weeks of setup, inventory for 6 separate stores, chest freezers for cold drinks and ice cream in each location, shopfront repairs, and small renovations to make each space presentable, since the buildings themselves, as I should have paid closer attention to at the time, were owned outright by various branches of Bing's extended family, not by us, not by the business, simply lent to the enterprise the way you'd lend a spare room. I want to break down that 48,000 a little more precisely, because the specific numbers still matter to me, the way precise figures always have. Roughly 22,000 went to initial inventory across the 6 stores. Rice, canned goods, instant noodles, cooking oil, sachets of shampoo and coffee, cigarettes bought in bulk and broken down for individual sale, the whole familiar catalog of a Filipino corner shop. Another 11,000 went to the chest freezers themselves, 6 of them, decent commercial units rather than cheap ones, because Ray had convinced me, reasonably, that reliable cold storage for drinks and ice cream was where a meaningful chunk of daily profit would actually come from in that climate. The remaining 15,000 or so covered shopfront repairs, new signage, small counter renovations, and a modest cushion Ray asked for up front to cover what he called starting friction, minor unexpected costs in the early weeks that I, in my inexperience, didn't push back on nearly hard enough. For about 6 weeks after everything opened, I'll admit, I felt something close to pride I hadn't experienced since retiring from the post. I'd walk between the 6 stores most mornings, a route of my own making this time, the way I used to walk Drumcondra decades earlier, except this route was mine, built by my own money, and the nieces working the counters would wave and call out Sir Wallace as I passed, and I remember thinking, quite sincerely, that I'd found a second purpose in my 60s I hadn't expected to find at all. The word that undid all of it, a word I didn't properly understand until it had already eaten most of what I'd put in, was lista. I'd heard the word before, in passing, without registering its significance. Lista, in the context of a Sari-Sari store, is the informal credit list every shop extends to its regular neighborhood customers. A running tab, written in a notebook, settled whenever the customer's own money comes in, payday or remittance day, or whenever it happens to land. It's such an ordinary, accepted part of daily life in these neighborhoods that nobody thought to explain its mechanics to me directly, the way you wouldn't think to explain to a visitor how a queue works. Everyone simply assumed I understood it, the way everyone assumed I understood so much else about how things actually ran, versus how they appeared to run from the outside. Here is what I slowly came to understand, piece by piece, over those first 6 devastating weeks. When the storekeeper is a stranger, lista functions more or less the way you'd expect any informal credit system to function. Extended cautiously, tracked carefully, collected reasonably promptly, because a stranger has no obligation to extend endless grace. When the storekeeper is family, and the capital funding the shelves belongs to a foreigner who married into that family, lista becomes something else entirely. It becomes, in practice if not in anyone's stated intention, a kind of unspoken philosophy about whose money actually matters. I want to describe the specific moment the word first properly registered with me, because up until then I genuinely thought it was simply a word for a shopping list, nothing more sinister than that. It was during my second week walking the stores, and I noticed a woman I recognized as a distant cousin of Bing's take a bag of rice and 2 cans of corned beef from the smallest store without any money, changing hands at all, simply a nod exchanged with the niece behind the counter, and a few words scrawled in a spiral notebook kept beside the register. I asked, mildly curious rather than alarmed at that point, what had just happened, and Ray, standing beside me, said simply, "Ah, that's lista lang, Sir Wallace. Normal." I remember nodding along, filing it away as some minor local custom, entirely failing to grasp, in that moment, that I'd just watched the first of what would turn out to be many thousands of small, uncollected transactions, quietly draining the shelves I'd paid to fill. Everyone in those 6 neighborhoods bought on credit. Nearly nobody paid it back promptly, and in a meaningful number of cases, nobody paid it back at all. And here is the detail that still, 3 years later, sits strangely in my chest. Collecting seriously from your own aunt, your own cousin, your own childhood neighbor, when you're the one running the till, is close to unthinkable in that culture. A genuine social impossibility rather than mere reluctance. The nieces staffing my stores weren't stealing from me. Not exactly. Not in any sense they'd have recognized as theft. They were simply doing what an entire community expected of family running a family shop. Extending grace to people they'd known their whole lives, using inventory I'd paid for, in exchange for entries in 6 separate notebooks that were never once properly reconciled against each other, or against reality. I remember the first time I actually looked closely at one of those notebooks. about 5 weeks in, sitting in the back of the smallest of the 6 stores while my niece by marriage, Marites, restocked shelves around me. Page after page of names I half recognized from Nane Corazon's neighborhood, small amounts scrawled beside each one. 20 pesos, 40 pesos, 150 for someone's larger purchase, with almost no corresponding column showing anything paid back. I asked Marites, as gently as I could manage, how often these debts actually got settled. She looked at me, with what I can only describe as genuine confusion at the question itself, as though I'd asked her how often the sun came up, and said, "When they have money, Sir Wallace, sometimes long time." I asked what happened if someone simply never had money. She shrugged, not unkindly, and said, "Then maybe next generation pays. Or maybe not. It's okay lang. It's okay lang." I've thought about that phrase more than almost any other sentence spoken to me across 3 years in that country. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even, from where Marites stood, mismanagement. It was simply the honest, unguarded truth about how the system she'd grown up inside of actually operated, delivered to a man who'd spent 4 decades in a profession built entirely on precision, on every single item accounted for, and delivered exactly where it belonged. By week 8, the inventory in all 6 stores had thinned dramatically, walked out the door in exchange for pencil entries rather than cash, and Ray, increasingly anxious about the visible decline, began arranging what he called restocking loans to keep the shelves filled, while the lista debts theoretically resolved themselves over time. I want to be honest that I didn't fully understand, at the time, the terms of those loans, or the identity of the lenders involved. Informal, local financing, the kind that exists in every province, charging interest rates that would be flatly illegal back in Ireland, but were simply how emergency capital moved in that part of the world. Bing signed for several of those loans, her name on the paperwork rather than mine, for reasons that felt practical at the time. She had the local documentation, the established relationships with the lenders, but that left me in the deeply uncomfortable position, later, of debts that were legally hers but morally, unmistakably, mine, since every peso of the original capital had come from my account. I remember the day Ray first brought up the restocking loans clearly, sitting in the kitchen of the family home with a folder of paperwork I couldn't read properly, all in Tagalog, and Ray explaining the terms to me secondhand through Bing, rather than through anyone directly accountable to me. I asked, reasonably I thought, whether we could simply slow down, stop restocking for a week or 2, let the list of debts catch up naturally rather than compounding new borrowed capital on top of an already leaking system. Ray's face changed at the suggestion, something between embarrassment and genuine anxiety, and he explained that an empty shelf in a Sari-Sari store is its own kind of failure, a visible sign to the whole neighborhood that the family running it can't manage, a loss of face that would make everything else, the lista collections, the family's standing, future credit of any kind, considerably harder to recover from. I didn't fully understand that logic at the time. I understand it better now, though understanding it hasn't made the financial consequences any easier to have lived through. By week 10, the smallest store closed first, quietly, no announcement, simply a shutter that stayed down one morning and never came back up. I asked Bing about it, and she said, tired in a way I hadn't heard from her before, Marite's husband got work in Manila. They had to go. A reasonable explanation on its own. I only learned much later that the store had also, by that point, been effectively hollowed out by unpaid credit, and Marite's leaving for Manila was as much an exit from an impossible situation as it was a genuine job opportunity. The other 5 stores followed over the next several weeks, one chest freezer unplugged at a time, each closure explained separately, reasonably, individually plausible, a family obligation here, a health issue there, a relative simply deciding the arrangement wasn't worth the awkwardness of managing debt against blood relations. By the 90-day mark, all 6 stores had gone dark, and what remained wasn't a business at all. Just 6 mostly empty shopfronts, owned by various relatives, and a stack of restocking loans, signed by my wife, that would take the better part of 3 years to fully settle. I want to tell you about the conversation with Connor that finally made me confront how badly things had actually gone. Because I'd been keeping the full picture from my own children for longer than I should have, out of a familiar kind of embarrassment I suspect a lot of men in these stories understand well. Connor called me one evening, maybe 4 months into the collapse, asking casually how the shop thing was going, and something in my hesitation must have given me away, because he pressed, gently but firmly, the way he does, until I finally told him roughly what had happened. He went quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, that's nearly your whole retirement top-up. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I didn't have a good answer for him then. I've had 3 years to develop one since, and the honest answer is that admitting the scale of it, out loud, to my own son, felt like admitting I'd been foolish in a way I wasn't ready to hear, confirmed by someone I respected as much as I respect Connor. Connor, to his considerable credit, didn't spend that call lecturing me. He asked practical questions instead, whether there was any paperwork I could send him, whether the loans Bing had signed carried any risk of following me back to Ireland legally, whether I had a proper handle on the total exposure. He's a details man, works in insurance for a reason, and I remember feeling, by the end of that call, a specific gratitude that at least one person in my life was approaching this with a clear head, while I'd spent months approaching it mostly with a quiet, private shame. He offered to fly out and look at things himself, which I declined at the time, telling him it wasn't necessary, though I've since wondered whether accepting that offer might have shortened the whole ordeal by a few months, simply by having a second, sober set of eyes on the arrangement earlier than I allowed. Aoife, when she found out a little later, was less gentle about it, though I don't fault her for that either. "Dad, you sent nearly 50 grand to a business run by people you barely knew a year before," she said on a video call. Not unkindly exactly, but with the particular bluntness only a daughter seems entitled to use with her father. I told her it wasn't quite as reckless as that made it sound, that I'd known the family for over 2 years by then, that the logic of the business itself had been sound. She wasn't wrong to push back, and I've come to appreciate, slowly, that both things can be true at once. The underlying business logic genuinely was sound, and I genuinely had been naive about the mechanics of credit and obligation that would end up undoing it. Aoife flew out to Dublin for a weekend not long after that call, ostensibly for an unrelated reason, though I suspect now it was at least partly to check on me directly, rather than simply trust what I'd told her over a screen. We didn't talk about the stores much that weekend, actually. Mostly just ordinary father-daughter things, a walk along the canal, a meal she insisted on cooking herself in my kitchen. But on the Sunday, before her flight back, she said, quietly, without any of the earlier bluntness, "I just want you to be careful with what's left, Dad. That's all." I told her I would be, and I've tried, in the years since, to actually mean that promise, rather than simply offer it as something reassuring to say in the moment. The debts themselves took nearly 3 years to fully clear, paid down gradually out of my pension, month by month, a slow, unglamorous grind that involved considerably less drama than the setup itself had, but ground down at me in its own quiet way regardless. There were months I genuinely worried about covering both the loan repayments and ordinary living costs. Months I put off a needed dental procedure back in Dublin, longer than I should have, simply to keep the repayments current and avoid the compounding interest the local lenders would have happily applied. I want to be specific about what those 3 years actually looked like, month to month, because I think the slow grind matters more to an honest account of this than the dramatic 90-day collapse does. I set up a spreadsheet, my own version of Ray's ledgers except properly reconciled this time, tracking each loan, its interest schedule, and what portion of my monthly pension I could reasonably divert toward repayment without leaving myself genuinely short. Some months I managed to pay down more than planned. Other months, an unexpected cost on either side, a health issue for Nane Corazon, a repair needed on the Dublin house, meant falling behind on my own schedule and watching the interest compound a little further than I'd have liked. I remember, about a year and a half in, calculating that I'd effectively paid back close to double the original restocking loan amounts once interest was fully accounted for. A fact I didn't share with Bing at the time, because I wasn't sure what good it would do, beyond making an already difficult situation feel more bitter than it needed to. I confronted Bing properly about all of it, finally, honestly, somewhere around the 18-month mark, once the initial shock had worn into something closer to a settled, exhausted grief. I asked her, plainly, whether she'd understood, going into the arrangement, how the lista system would inevitably undermine it. She was quiet for a long time before she answered, and when she did, she didn't deny understanding it. She said, "I knew it could happen like this. I didn't want to think about it, because I wanted my family to have the chance." I've sat with that answer for a long time since. It isn't the answer of a woman who set out deliberately to defraud me. It's the answer of a woman caught between a husband's money and a family's genuine need, who chose, when it mattered, not to warn me clearly enough about a risk she understood better than I ever could have on my own. I asked her, too, why her name had ended up on the restocking loans instead of mine, whether that had been a deliberate choice to protect me, or simply the more practical local option. She said it had genuinely been about practicality. The lenders knew her, trusted her local standing, wouldn't have extended the same terms to a foreigner, regardless of how much capital I'd already put in. I believe that answer, for what it's worth, though believing it hasn't made the 3 years of repayments feel any less like a debt that was, in every meaningful sense, entirely mine. I still have one of the lista notebooks. I brought it back to Dublin with me during one of my visits home, almost as a kind of evidence, though evidence of what exactly I've never been entirely sure. I keep it in the same drawer where I used to keep old route sheets from my postal days, and every so often, on a quiet evening, I'll take it out and read through the names again. Some of them I recognize even now. Tita Baby, who owed 38 pesos across 4 separate visits and never once repaid a centavo of it. A boy named Jomar who bought ice candy on credit almost daily for a full month. A man simply listed as Kuya Rani, whose entries stopped abruptly halfway through the notebook, with no explanation for why. There's one entry near the back of that notebook I've never been able to look at without feeling something complicated. A woman's name, Aling Feli, with a running total that eventually reached nearly 300 pesos, larger than almost any other single account in the book. I asked Marites about her once, mostly out of idle curiosity by that point, since the stores were already failing and there wasn't much practical use left in the question. Marites told me Aling Feli was an elderly widow, alone, no children nearby, who'd been buying small amounts of rice and canned sardines on credit for months, because her own pension, such as it was, barely covered her rent. I remember sitting with that answer for a long time. It didn't change the arithmetic of what the lista system had done to my 48,000 euros. It did change, permanently, how uncomplicated I was able to feel about resenting the system itself, once I understood that at least some of what it was actually doing, underneath all the mismanagement, was quietly keeping an old woman fed. Page after page of names and small numbers, an accounting, in its own strange way, of an entire community, written in a hand I recognized as Marites's, careful and neat, despite how little any of it was ever actually reconciled against reality. I think about my old postal route sometimes. When I look at that notebook, the 2 lists side by side in my memory, one built on absolute precision, every address accounted for, every delivery completed and confirmed, 41 years without a single significant error I can recall. The other built on something closer to communal faith, an entire neighborhood extending each other grace on the understanding that eventually, somehow, it would even out, even when the numbers plainly showed it never would. I genuinely still can't decide, after 3 years of turning it over, whether I was robbed or simply introduced, for the first time in my 68 years, to how differently the world runs when the precision you've built your whole working life around simply doesn't apply to the place you've landed in. I don't think Ray set out to defraud me, not in any way I could point to cleanly. I don't think Marites or the other nieces were stealing, not in their own understanding of the word. I don't even think Bing deliberately deceived me, though I do think she let hope do some quiet, convenient editing of the risks she should have laid out for me more plainly before I signed off on 48,000 euros. What I've settled into, 3 years on, isn't quite forgiveness, and isn't quite resentment either. It's something closer to a recalibrated respect for how much I genuinely don't understand about systems I wasn't raised inside of, and for how much damage good intentions can do when they collide with an economic logic built on entirely different assumptions than the ones I spent 41 years operating inside. Bing and I are still married. That surprises some people when I tell this story, but the marriage itself, stripped of the Sari-Sari catastrophe sitting inside it, has held up reasonably well, built on a genuine fondness that survived even this. We don't discuss the stores much anymore. There's not much left to say about them that hasn't already been said, several times over, across some difficult evenings on Nane Corazon's porch. I think, honestly, that surviving those difficult conversations together, rather than the collapse itself, is what ended up telling me the most about whether the marriage was real. There were nights, particularly around the 18-month and 2-year marks, where the strain of the debt repayments genuinely tested both of us, sharp words exchanged that neither of us was proud of afterward. But Bing never once, across any of those difficult conversations, tried to shift the full weight of it onto me alone, and I never once, despite considerable temptation on some of the harder nights, tried to shift the full weight of it onto her family alone. We settled, gradually, into sharing the discomfort of it honestly, which I've come to think matters more, in a marriage, than either of us ever fully understanding the lista system in the first place. I did learn one lasting lesson out of all of it, and it's a smaller, more useful lesson than the dramatic ones these stories usually end on. I no longer fund anything in the Philippines, however sound the logic, without insisting on the same kind of documentation I'd have insisted on for anyone back in Dublin. Actual ledgers, actual reconciliation, actual clarity about whose name sits on any debt before a single euro moves. Ray's still fond of me, I think, in his own way, and he's mentioned once or twice, half joking, a smaller idea for a single store, better managed this time, tighter controls. I've told him, gently but firmly, that my delivering days are over, in every sense of that phrase. I still walk most mornings here in Dublin, old habit from the post, tracing a version of my old route, even though I've no letters left to deliver along it. I think, some mornings, about the 6 stores and the 6 notebooks and the names I still half remember, and I've decided that whatever I actually was in that story, investor, husband, mark, or simply a man from one world trying, clumsily, to build something in another, I'd still rather have tried and been humbled by it than never have walked that second route at all. I ran into Malachi, my old postal colleague, a few months back, the same man who'd warned me half-joking at the wedding to mind myself out there. We had a pint together, and eventually the Sari-Sari stores came up, as they tend to whenever old friends ask how retirement's actually been treating me. He didn't say "I told you so," to his credit, though he'd have earned the right to. He just listened, nodded along at the right points, and near the end said, "Ah well, Wallace, sure you always were a man who liked knowing exactly where everything was going." I laughed at that, because it's true, and because I think it's as good a summary of the whole episode as anyone's managed to give me. 41 years of knowing precisely where every letter belonged, and then one investment, one word I didn't understand properly, undid a portion of what all that precision had built. I'm not sure that's tragedy, exactly. I've come to think it might just be what it looks like when a careful man finally steps somewhere the map he'd spent his whole life trusting simply doesn't reach.